But the fact is that a large number of independents, a large number of Democrats, and a huge number of Republicans do not believe that they are getting a straight story from the so-called legitimate media. So I'd be interested in what people are thinking about this, how they view various news operations, and what are you what do you trust, and who do you mistrust,
Just
and
to
why?
prompt the discussion, today's headline was from Harvard University, the Neiman Laboratory Journalism, and the subhead was "Fake News" or "Real News About Fake News." Democrats see most news outlets as unbiased. Republicans think they're almost all biased. And then it goes into great detail about how that,
Right.
how that.
And you can see when you
plays out.
look at, and we have some of those sheets, Rick, don't we, available, you can see as you look which side of the political spectrum people are on and which of those news organizations they favor versus the other, and it is diametrically opposed.
Yeah.
In virtually every case.
So, what do you think?
I've, every day, I look at like Chicago Tribune, I look at CNN, Fox, Drudge, and one other news article I can't think of it, is hoping to get among all of them maybe a more balanced look at what the news story of the day is. But on CNN, I notice you'll bring up CNN many times, see a big picture, big headline, and it's the top story. And people go in there and they read it, but if you notice, many times in the bottom left-hand corner is the word analysis. People don't see, I don't think, for the most part, the word analysis, and they see that and they click on it and think it's a news story. So the premise that you see a lot of opinion with reporting in news, I think is
Or
very
sponsored content.
real. Yeah, or sponsored content.
Yeah, and often a corporation, an advertiser will, instead of having an ad, they will sponsor content which looks like, feels like editorial copy, but isn't. Yeah.
I have a couple things I run across in the news once in a while when I'm reading or listening to the TV or the radio. They use the phrase, and a reliable anonymous source says, well, I won't take it any further than that. I doubt that that's on your list of
What's that?
qualifications there.
Oh, of what?
I didn't-
A reliable anonymous source?
I don't think that would be good. A newspaper, a person that would use an anonymous.
Well, there are some interesting ethical challenges with that, but I can assure you that good journalists, as opposed to not so good journalists, will tell you, if you're going to use an anonymous source, tell me, the editor, who that is, and prove that they know what they're talking about, and get me other sources. But you're right, a reliable anonymous source could be, could not be, but a good journalist will back it up.
It's always the case that if you've got a source that you can name, that's better.
Absolutely.
But understand the way journalism works, especially investigative journalism. There are areas where people don't want the light to be shown. And the way oftentimes a journalist has to work in order to get the light into those corners is to work with people who are willing to tell a story if their identity is protected, so that they can tell that hopefully without repercussions. I mean, the most obvious example is Deep Throat during Watergate. Now, again, you need, as a reporter, you need to be careful of who those sources are, and you have to establish their reliability if you're willing to rely on them. Because you can, and one of the things you do is you ask yourself, again, in this honing your skepticism, why is he telling me this? What's his angle? Is he trying to play me for some reason? You've got to be very careful with that. But in the end, it may be that the only way you can get at some of these stories is through the use of those types of sources.
I agree, but I wanted to bring that up because my next question is, I imagine you have the statistics on this. How many liberals opposed to conservatives will you find in the mainstream media? Have you done research on that?
I have not, but there is research on that. And the question is, when you say are liberal, or expresses liberal values on some issues and not others, or conservative values on some and not others, I don't have the answer to that. I haven't done that research. But I think what you're getting at is, how does anybody, regardless of whether they're liberal or conservative, or they express liberal or conservative points of view, how does anybody back it up? That to me is what matters. And the second thing that comes up clearly, let me go back to the anonymity thing, right here in the Code of Ethics, for example. And this is stuff that you learn in journalism school, and you learn, the interesting part is, the most difficult journalism job is not to be at the New York Times. The most difficult journalism job is to be a community newspaper reporter. Because you better get it right. Because if you don't, your neighbor or your in-law or your teacher or your kid's teacher or somebody, or the beauty shop operator is going to call you on it. So be very, very careful about what somebody says to you and what you report in the paper. It is your job to be accountable.
Right, man.
It is your job to be accountable.
The same is true of high school journalists.
Yeah, you bet. And you know, what's the difference between a rumor and a fact, and maybe a fact that is important to share? You know, and that's one of the roles of journalism is, you know, I asked Nick when we were talking, and Jim, you can talk about it too. What is news? I always talk to students, it's something new, different, unique, interesting, might have an impact on the way people behave. Everything isn't news. But what's news in a small town, whether Nellie plays pinochle with her friends on Thursday, it's important to those people, probably not important in the Chicago Tribune, but we all define these things differently. And so I will be honest, I really don't, I wouldn't say I don't care, but it doesn't matter to me too much whether someone is known as a liberal or a conservative. I want to know, what are they saying? Can they back it up?
Yeah, I think that's the proof. The proof is in the product. And I can only speak from my own experience. Again, 30 years working in national radio. I worked with some of the most personally liberal people I've ever known, some of the most conservative people I've ever known, and there are people I've worked with for 30 years, I have no idea what their politics are. The key is, and when you walk through the door, all of that stays outside, because when you get there, you realize that what my duty is not to tell you what my politics are about, and not to impose some kind of agenda on you, but to tell you what I know to be true as best I can determine.
That's the way it should be.
And that's the way it should be. And again, I would say, we don't say when we go to a doctor or a lawyer or an auto mechanic, are you a Democrat or a Republican? It's, can you fix my car? Can you get me off the hook on this traffic ticket, and can you fix my inning? The proof is in the product.
Yeah. But I think it's fair, since you're the one, Nick, who has been emphasizing skepticism, for the gentleman to be skeptical about whether 8 out of 10 reporting journalists are liberal and only 2 are conservative. People who go into business school tend to be conservative. People who tend to go into the liberal arts and humanities fields like journalism may tend to be more liberal. And so then you have the question of, while they may report objectively, how do they select which stories are important? Certain stories may be more important to a person of a certain persuasion than others. And how often do they report, not only select, but then how often do they report on the same story? I'm just simply saying that skepticism should be a part of all of this.
Yeah, right. I agree.
By the way, headlines, the headless and the topless is great, but I still go back to the Bloomington Normal Pantograph wedding story that reported normal man marries oblong woman.
You can't pay enough for a good journalist.
Yeah.
In this day and age, with the millennials and down, have you done a survey on who the readership is of newspapers. Are younger people starting to pick it up, or is it the ones of us that have been here a while and the others are using texting and telephones and all that good
It's
stuff?
funny, when you said are younger people picking up, I wish. You know, ever since I've been involved, the newspaper industry, newspapers and education has been working on encouraging young people to read the newspaper. I don't know. Sam,
Yeah, Sam.
I mean, it's
has
a
something.
good, but talk about that.
Sam?
Well,
What do
newspaper
we know?
readership is based upon an aging population. There's no
Yeah.
doubt about it.
Yeah.
So don't go anywhere, Bob, we need you.
Well, a bunch of us aren't trying to go anywhere, but the good Lord once in a while says you're going home.
But part of it is, it's what you were used to as you grew up. I mean, you weren't exposed to social media and, the internet has changed the world.
Well, I
Not
think
necessarily for the best.
once in a while you look at some of these shows where they interview young people in the street,
Yeah.
and it's dumbfounding what they don't know.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm wondering, are they putting it on? I don't think they're putting it on.
Well, and I just, one of the things that we discussed at WBBM News Radio, which if you're familiar with the format, you know what it's all about. It's news, weather, traffic, in a constant cycle that repeats itself. That's certainly by design. But one of the challenges we think we face going forward is how long are people going to need what we're providing? Because they can get it so many other, you can pick up your phone and you can look and see where the traffic is backed up, you get the weather report, you get the latest sports scores, you get news headlines. So why do they need to turn on the radio? And I think younger people, I think that it's not going too far to say fewer of them have any connection with radio in the way that we older people do, because again, they have other sources for their news and entertainment and their information. So it's a challenge for the older media, newspapers and everybody else going forward as to how to try to attract younger people and not just service all of those of us who are.
From a newspaper's perspective, though, I think as young people age and they become more and more part of the community, that's when they become more and more apt to become a newspaper reader, because that is their sense of community, that is their tie to the community.
And plus, of course, the digital platform, I'm sure, has helped to sort of bridge that, that generational divide.
But as they get older, they want to know what's happening around them. They have kids in school, they want to know what's going on in school, so, that's the basis of community journalism.
I think that part of what we're discussing has to do with the attention span. And there is
Yeah.
lots of research. Our attention span is getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. I don't know about yours, but mine certainly is. But what's frightening and dangerous, and you'll hear it over and over again, or we should be hearing it, is how easy it is to get your brand meme or your whatever it is, your message out once. And it's either outrageous enough, or it's new enough, or it's popularly, in terms of popular culture, it's entertaining enough that it gets known, it goes viral. And tens or hundreds of millions of people can hear about it before anybody even checked it out. I mean, it's just dead wrong, or it's dead stupid. And that relates to our short attention span. I'm amazed that Chicago Tribune has 4 full pages on their deep, long feature stories. I mean, it's wonderful that they do that. And I love reading, but I don't read the whole thing. And I think all of us have that problem. You're in this room because you care about these issues, but most people who aren't in this room don't care about these issues. So, back to the attention, interest, desire, action, everybody is trying to get our attention, so that we will be interested and we will desire to do something and we will act. And that's the information environment we're in. And what it results in is crazier and crazier and wilder and often less true assertions being made and going viral immediately. And I think to me, that's dangerous, that's frightening. It's just not right.
Or how many people here feel they're so inundated that they can't, they just, they get to a point where they say they either tune out or they say, I don't know what to believe anymore. Any hands,
Yeah.
people who feel that way? Yeah, and I mean, I think, and this is part of the problem, because there is so much of it, but it's also, and this is what is most dangerous, is this allows people with no good intentions to exploit that in ways that, just, it plays into our exhaustion with trying to keep up with things. And when we feel we can't, then we fall prey, just as we do when we're physically fatigued, to making mistakes. Perhaps not checking things out as carefully as we should. And I think it's a great, again, it's a great challenge going forward, because I don't for a moment think that whatever onslaught we endured during the 2016 election, especially on social media, we're not going to continue to face, and probably in spades as time goes on.
What about the term infotainment? Does that have any legitimacy?
Infotainment?
Infotainment.
Well, it has commercial legitimacy, because anybody who has any kind of message to get across will try to attach it to something that appeals to the people they're trying to reach, whatever part of the market it is. So I'm struck by the fact that I spent 20, 30 years in public relations. And what we do in public relations is we get people to feel wonderful about whatever it is we're trying to promote. Now, some of those things weren't so great. You know, lead paint, not so great, and there's all kinds of poisons in the environment that people use very effective public relations to promote. There's medicines that are being promoted every day. I mean, if you watch television for, any medium that we have, we look at much of, in fact, I think probably most of it is commercially promoted. Let's just talk about, and be controversial, I guess, taboola. Taboola. You know, this beautiful child now looks like an old hag. Or, now you won't believe what she looks like now. She weighs 500 pounds. And you won't believe this truck, drove over 14 people, and he went on to the, if almost every newspaper that's online that I see has these boxes of information on the bottom that are clickbait, that have amazing stories to get our attention, that even though we know better, we click on every once in a while to see, do they really, is it as terrible as they say? Now, how do we separate truth from they're just trying to get our attention so they can get us on their mailing list? Yeah.
We no longer teach civics in grade schools, junior high, high school.
Yep.
I taught English, and I taught the Declaration of Independence. It was in the textbook. The next textbook didn't have it.
Yeah.
I really think that's one of the reasons that the younger generations, first of all, don't know and are so easily swayed.
Yeah.
I would note that in the past year, there was a law enacted in Illinois which requires that one of the 4 semesters of social science required in high school must be a civics course.
And it passed.
Yeah, so as of this past year. Now, there are lots of things required to be taught in state statute that are blown off, but this one is to be a credit course, and so maybe there's been some responsiveness to your concerns.
Which brings us to one
There
of
is a
the
civics
points.
course at Princeton High School.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
what, and I know the 8th grade does the Constitution test still and does the government classes, but I do know there's a civics course at Princeton High School that I believe is required.
The Center for News Literacy has a fantastic curriculum, which teaches many, many of the issues that would come up in a civics course, and how they relate to media and literacy and civic engagement, all those kinds of things. The Center for News Literacy. And if you go online and look at that, it reminds me of, it's funny, 1963, I think, the debate topic for debating teams in high school for the entire United States, I know this because I had to argue both sides, was resolved, the federal government should provide complete medical care for all citizens. Well, that's interesting. And you had to do pro and con. You had to know both sides. Well, that's civics at its absolute best. And I think we could be doing that now. We ought to be doing more of that now. We ought to be having media literacy courses in schools. And I would encourage any of you, all of us, to be offering to help implement something like that. I think it'd be really helpful.
I also think it's very important to not only get outside your comfort zone, so if you're on one particular part of the spectrum or another, go to the other side, see what people are saying. You know, look at those opinions. And then also gather from a number of different sources. I mean, you can pick up your phone and see something on Facebook, read the paper, read a magazine, look at television, listen to the radio, gather from a number of different sources. Because through that synthesis, I think you come to a more well-rounded view of things and deeper understanding of a particular issue. If you're stuck in one pipeline, it's harder to do that because you're not likely perhaps to get exposed to some point of view that you may not have seen. I think one of the great observations, I think, is that one of the problems with news aggregators, if you know what those are, the things that just bring you the kind of content that you want to see. You know, you choose exactly what you want to see. As opposed to picking up a newspaper and leafing through a newspaper is, you may be caught by something you never would have anticipated would be of interest to you. But you wouldn't know that if you just have it so narrowly channeled. So look for ways to sort of get out of that and expand your horizons, and I think that helps make a difference too in your discernment and in your ability to formulate a better view of things. And this comes certainly into play with public policy.
A quick observation and then a serious question for you other journalists, including Sam and others of you, but the quick observation has to do with what is news, and I don't know if any of you would have come across this old observation about the origin of the word news, and you guys can disconfirm this or not, but I was told that it was looking at a weather vane from a particular perspective you see in north, east, west, south. Anybody confirm that or not?
Well, I can't, no.
Think about it.
I will
think
say
that's
that,
where- But then, oh no, I have my serious question. So all of what we've been saying is well and good. So how do we apply it to today when, as I think we've agreed, we are overwhelmed with information and more is less? So how do we, you mentioned a smorgasbord of perspectives or different publications. That's one way of dealing with it. But I really am worried about this overwhelming amount of information which illiterate people cannot absorb, and I would guess most of us are rather illiterate when it comes to this question of media literacy.
Well, I was once hired by the state of Wisconsin to translate all their unemployment compensation literature into plain language. And what we did was we did focus groups and we showed people the publications that they give to you when you lose your job. And the state was upset that people didn't know that they were, one, eligible for benefits, and number two, that there were certain things they could and could not do, or they might lose their benefits. And they couldn't understand why people didn't know more about this. So we would bring a brochure and have a group of people, and I said, I want you to look at this brochure and put an X over any part that you have a hard time understanding. And I remember the day I gave them a 36, the fundamental piece of literature to learn about what do you do if you're unemployed. It was 36 pages. And 3 of the 8 women in the group put a big X over the entire book. And then I began to realize that of the 8 people in the room, 3 of the women had their babies on their laps. 2 of them did not speak English as their first language. 2 had cognitive disabilities, and 1 of them was a regular reader of daily newspapers. All right? So that's the reality of our culture, our society. And yes, there is too much information. The state of Wisconsin felt obliged legally to give everybody every single word of the statutes that relate to unemployment, which if they did it, nobody would read it. So I don't really have an answer. I just know that all of us, all of you, I do, I just don't read as all this stuff. I look at the headlines. I can't read with as much attention as I used to. I scan. I look for something that's going to get me to stop. And even when I read wonderful literature, it happens to me. I look for something that says, well, where's the story going? And I can read faster. And it's just a habit. So it's a really important point that you're making. There is too much.
So do you pick 3 or 4 that just fit your personality and say, I'm gonna stick with this radio source or this TV source or this newspaper source?
Yeah, and that,
Versus the smorgasbord idea, which could thoroughly confuse people. And you say, what makes sense to me? It's like picking the right doctor or the car mechanic. Let's find the reliable source that I feel comfortable with and just go with that.
yeah, I would encourage you to look at this story. It was in the online today. I don't know where it came out. The Neiman Lab. It was a story that came out about media habits of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, and media. You know, where do we turn? What do people? If people believe that most media are not trustworthy or credible, what are the most popularly perceived to be credible media? And it's I could read it to you. It's pretty interesting. I mean, public radio and television come in pretty good. I heard the other day somebody said, well, shouldn't surprise you, their job is to present information that's for the public. Their job is not to deliver advertisers, but it sort of is because they need listeners. So yeah.
It seems to me a lot of this started many years ago when they stopped making it so that you had to show both sides. I don't know, sometimes.
Fairness doctrine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden we had things like Rush Limbaugh, and then it got to the point where we had 24-hour news media, they had to fill the cycle. And, you know, at first they had, you know, the war or whatever that started it, but then they just had to keep filling it up. And so they would beat the subject to death. But then it started to become this false equivalency thing, where they had to show both sides. You know, they would bring in, even if 90% of the scientists said something is true, they would bring in one guy that said it wasn't, and it was supposed to be equivalent. And now we've gotten to the point where, you know, for years, you know, they've been saying, for example, I think it was in the news just the other day, and I don't know how true this news is, but I remember reading that, you know, Trump has been saying that the climate change is a Chinese hoax for years, and now he's saying, well, it's too late, it's gonna be, you know, 6 degrees more temperature in 100 years. So it's, you know, just go ahead and pollute all you want, because no matter what we do, it's not gonna make a difference. I mean, we've gone from one thing to the other because, you know, we're not getting the actual news. We've got these false equivalencies. They're not, somehow the media itself has to step up and say, no, this is what's really true.
Well, it's interesting you would say that. This is if you've seen this flyer, this is an interesting response of Microsoft and major news media and several other organizations who say they identify websites and sources of news, and they help you, they have standards for helping you answer the question, who's feeding you the news? And it's like a nutrition label. And it says, for example, they have a little label there's one that's green and one that's red. It says, doesn't repeatedly publish false content, gathers and presents information responsibly, regularly corrects or clarifies errors, handles the difference between news and opinion responsibly, avoids deceptive headlines, website discloses ownership and financing. Who owns the website or who owns the newspaper or the medium? Clearly labels advertising as opposed to editorial or news. Reveals who's in charge, including any possible conflicts of interest. And lastly, provides information about content creators. Now, what they do is they have a board of not only journalists, but communication experts and specialists who apply these standards, and they're written in great detail. And when you now do a search online or go to Facebook, you can see right away how they measure up on these standards. And it's a really good technique, I think. It's not perfect yet because it's new, but it is I thought, a thoughtful, measured response to some of the things that we're talking about today, that both media and communication experts of all kinds are looking at. So I would encourage you to look at this. It's called NewsGuard. NewsGuard. And it describes, they put a weighted, there's more, some of these things are more important than others. But you can look right away and you can see how they measure up. I mean, the National Enquirer probably violates 9 out of 10 journalism ethical standards that we would consider. All right, so it wouldn't measure up terribly well. But other newspapers are pretty good in some things, not in others. This is a great tool for that. The other tools are one that we were going to bring up and we never got to.
By the way, if I recall that correctly, one defense it gave itself against criticism that it was a liberal outlet was that it gave Fox a green light.
Yeah, well, and it will give a lot of, it measures the websites of the medium and the organization. And I think it's pretty,
Rick, what's the source?
it's called NewsGuard, newsguardtech.com. And it says right here, the free news literacy browser extension, when you browse, you can go on there and it tells you right away, is possible in part by support from Microsoft, okay? But there are other, internet providers, I think, who are involved, and Google's involved, and it's growing and it's getting better all the time.
One of the guys behind it is Steve Brill,
Yeah.
who founded Court TV years ago, and he's been involved in journalism as a writer and commentator and entrepreneur for a long time. And I think what's valuable about this, and I'm glad we got to it because it had completely slipped my mind, is that these websites are vetted by experienced journalists. So they take a look and say, all right, about gauging the reliability.
Yeah.
Hopefully, so that when you get there, they're not going to tell you chapter and verse about every story, but they're going to say, what is the track record of this website? Reliable, not reliable.
Yeah.
I also think beyond this, and in listening to some of the comments that people have been made, I think what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we want from our journalists? Do we want a stenographer who does nothing but record the official line and put it in the paper or put it on television or radio or a website? Or do we want someone who, because they're a professional and have been at their profession for some time, can provide context, and it may not please all the people all the time, but because they have a particular view based on whether they're members of the White House press corps or they cover the city council or whatever, that they can provide in their professional expertise some depth to the coverage beyond just a recording of the bare facts. And realizing that can sometimes get close to a line where you may think they're interjecting some kind of an opinion when it may not be an opinion. But again, I think it's worth asking what we demand of our reporters. And then, like I said, the smorgasbord you should, I think, not just look into any publication anywhere, but choose ones that you have found have some degree of reliability or thoughtfulness, and it may be half a dozen of them across the spectrum. It doesn't have to be a dozen or 2 dozen, because we're all overwhelmed. But I think when you do that, if you can find those few that you feel are reliable, that's where you put your time and energy, and let the rest of it slide.
There is a great way to learn more about this. It's the News Literacy, the Center for News Literacy, and they have an interesting checklist called Checkology. You can take a little quiz that gives you a pretty good idea of what you know about journalism and what you don't know. And I took it really quickly late at night, and I got 6 out of 10 right, and I thought I was pretty smart. But how'd you do on it?
I failed. I got 75% on it, but some, and I must say that some of the questions are tough, even
Yeah.
for journalists, because they get into the weeds a little bit, and it goes beyond just what your normal kind of news IQ would be as a consumer. But it's worth taking, it's fun taking, and you can always tell people you scored 100.
I have a question for you. You mentioned that we graze,
Yep.
and that we all do. And you mentioned, Nick, about how you both mentioned principles of what I'll call objective reporting. But are those principles applied to headlines, which we all know have in the past been written with an eye toward intriguing the reader, maybe more than informing the reader?
And usually not written by the same person who wrote the story.
That's a good point too. I write columns and the editors always change the titles to my columns. Always.
They took that headless
It's
thing
required,
out,
I think.
topless thing in.
Well, I don't see how you can quibble with headless body in topless body.
It's hard to quibble with it.
That's not normal.
Hey, one reason we wanted to do this was, Nick and I were talking about, would it be useful to have a series, whether it was in newspapers or other media, where we had some simple things like these 5 sort of lessons, like in a box, and maybe have stories about interesting questions about media and how journalism works. But these, I think, are pretty straightforward, simple principles. And if you think it would be worthwhile, I'm hoping there's a way that we can get beyond the same people that we see every day and get mad with together. And we can start exploring this with people across the political spectrum. And if you think that's worth doing, talk to us and the media that you pay attention to, and let's explore how we might do more of this. There are references, and I'll follow up, and I would encourage you to sort of try your luck on this quiz, the Checkology they call it, from the Center for News Literacy. One thing that strikes me is when you mentioned that when we had, what was it, Larry, you called it, the...
Infotainment?
No, the question that you gotta have 2 points of view.
Oh, fairness doctrine.
Okay,
Oh,
fairness
yeah,
doctrine. That assumes that there are 2 points of view, or only 2 points of view. And frankly, as a human being, I mean, I had one of my high school students said, I am not a robot. Every time you fill out a little thing, it says, I'm not a robot. We are not robots. All things in life are not a binary choice. All right, that's why.
Back then it was, if you interviewed the Republican, you had to interview the Democrat. It was just, that was the way it was back then.
Yeah.
But then it got to the point, like I said, with false equivalencies, and that does us no good either.
Well, what I think is interesting about the whole concept of what we're discussing tonight is not just the nuances, the little things, but not just the headline, but all of the input and output that goes into this discussion and how we consume information. They're not just binary choices. I mean, you say, well, yes, you got to vote one person or another, but there are primaries, and there are ways that as we know, politicians and leaders of all kinds will change their minds. And they'll say one thing to one group and another thing to another group. And so do advertisers and commercial sponsors of all kinds. But there is science, and what we want to do is gather information in a way that empirically verifies what we believe about the world around us. And if we can't prove it in some way, at least we can get closer to it. And we can talk about it in a way that human beings do, rather than machines talk to each other.
But may not always validate our point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So this gets a little bit away from news exactly, but I find a kind of an antidote to being hooked on all the sources, particularly cable news, which I watch too much of. And I think you could never wind it back and not have cable news and just have network news where you might actually think at least it's sort of reliable. But I'd say the antidote for me some of the time is to watch C-SPAN, because I'm a liberal, or a left of liberal, and I actually watch some of the, panels and things that come from the Heritage Foundation, it's kind of refreshing. It's so unfiltered in a way, and you're not getting the quote analysis from the corporation that's telling you something. You're listening, and it's not exactly like sitting in a room and, as you said, it's really about person to person, but you can have a sense of the credibility of the people who are presenting. And so, isn't C-SPAN the result of cable news? Isn't the cable network?
Yeah.
I mean, aren't they the ones that have to pay for it? Because I
Yeah.
actually think cable news overall is a bane on our existence. But C-SPAN is, helps.
And it's so interesting, I never knew that so many speeches in Congress were being given to no one.
You know, cable news now, Chris and I talked about this, and two examples stand out. If you'll remember when the Malaysian airliner went down, CNN beat that story to death for weeks. And they do that a lot. And Chris and I were in Vietnam 10 years ago, and we were watching CNN International.
We didn't
And
even
it's
know
a
it
totally
existed.
different animal.
Yeah.
It's really good, solid news.
And we
it
cannot
covers the
receive
world.
it in the
World.
US.
Oh my
Huh?
God, the rest of the
We
world.
cannot receive it in the US.
I
Yeah,
know. We
that's
didn't even know it
crazy.
existed till we were over there. It was like, oh my God, it's just amazing.
Well, we could go on with this for a long time. There are a lot of really interesting issues. One is the consolidation of many different news media into being owned by one company, whether it's Sinclair or Gannett or Fox News or Trunk or whatever. But that's a scary issue for me, because it sounds like more and more people are hearing the same message from one source, whose primary mission may not necessarily be to inform the public for civically responsible things. So that's an issue. The other one is other forms of commercial influence on the media. And get right down to it, do we want our newspapers? Do we want TV and radio? If so, somebody's got to pay for it. How are we going to pay for it? In a way that minimally pollutes the credibility of the medium itself. I mean, that's a reality. So, there's some wonderful newspapers that started during newspaper strikes, and they all went out of business because they wouldn't get any advertising. So that's an equally important, not just politics we're after. And lastly, how do we have time to do anything else if we got so much to pay attention to we're watching it, we're reading it, we're listening to it, we're breathing it, we're talking about it. I think the most fundamental question is the one that you two are dealing with this ocean of overchoice and information. What does matter?
Well, just one thing that we shouldn't lose sight of, I don't think, and that is, the amendments to the Constitution, freedom of the press is not just an abstraction, right? We need to recognize the vibrancy of it and encourage the vibrancy of it. We're all together in this room to talk about it, what matters to us and what we'd like to see, misgivings about it. But it's important, and we need to guard against it being chipped away by those who seek to chip away at it and destroy it as an institution. The journalists that I know are hardworking people, men and women. They are not the enemies of the people. They do not traffic in fake news. They are not horrible people. They're professionals. They do their jobs day in and day out. And they ain't perfect, but they try. And I think on balance, they do a damn good job of it.
And with that, if you have some let's pursue that. I mean, maybe we can find some allies in getting media and news literacy in the schools, and using different ways to check the facts. PolitiFact is one, Snopes is another,
Right.
Center for News Literacy is another. The Annenberg School of Communication, Kathleen Jameson.
Annenberg Fact Check, I think,
.org, very, very good. So when in doubt, check it out.
Check it out, always.
I wanna compliment the audience. I once gave a talk to a Lions Club in a tiny burg in southern Illinois, and we held our dinner meeting at a tavern on the square at a table for 6. But after the meeting, the president of the club complimented me by saying it was the best turnout they'd had all year. And I was gonna tell Rick that I was expecting a table of 6 tonight for a topic like this. And
Yes,
very good observation.